Welcome to the Van Alen house. We'll start by looking at the exterior architecture of the building. On this end wall, the gable end, are spread across the side iron numerals giving the year the house was built, 1737. And if you look more closely, you can see there are also pins attached to or arrows attached to the building. Each of them pieces sit in a ring that has a long rod that goes through the brick wall and ties into the framing of the house on the inside. There are one or two places in the house where those iron rods show through, and I'll point those out when we get inside. The function of that is it really kind of ties the frame to the brick wall and is an important part of the structure or the stability of the structure. The numerals and the little arrows, however, are decorative, and in case of the numerals, informative as well. So and that's kind of a characteristic of the brick or of the Dutch house. We'll go around to the front now. Okay, the house was built in two sections. To the left is the earlier part. This line in the brick and mortar shows where that occurred, and then a hallway and another room were the second part. Looking over here, you can see an example of Dutch bonding, which is different from French or Flemish or English bonding. And the use of what are called clinker bricks with the black or the dark ends, they're put in a pattern, a distinctive pattern, that causes them to kind of accentuate the diamond pattern of the masonry. In a number of locations on the building, there has been repair over the years, some of it even 19th century. This is probably the best section of it on the building where it still is all intact. We'll go down to the cellar and look at some characteristics of the architecture there. As we go downstairs, you should notice, one, it's very low and you need to duck. Two, just above the entryway, there is a post over here that extends straight up into the garret and is kind of unusual to see this side of it because most of that is all buried in the brick wall, if you will. There's also a large beam that runs vertically, and that's the plate on which floorboards, etc., are attached. The hearth supports in the cellar are of special interest. Here, as you can see, a lovely graceful curve. They're built up. This bottom row along here is actually a rock ledge that's built into the cellar foundation. And then the bricks begin to be stacked and the curve developed across the top to here. This supports, as you will see upstairs, a substantial brick hearth and is, I think, one of the more dramatic features of this house is the contrast, for example, to a New England saltbox house where you have an enormous chimney stack that begins in the cellar and takes up most of the cellar space. Instead, here it's light, airy, and for the most part, it's not a low beam as we saw when we came in. The arch is an old form, started with the Romans, so the Dutch were not really doing anything new, but they did use it very effectively. Sometimes in old houses in this area, you will find a cellar wall with just a ledge sticking out, and the hearth, the Dutch hearth and so on, it was long ago replaced with something else or simply removed. But this is a clear signal when you find just the stone ledge of what had once been here or been there. And it does turn up not infrequently. For some people, it's a mystery as to why a Dutch house would be built almost in the middle of or near the middle of the 18th century, when everyone knows that the Dutch were sort of overtaken by the English in New York in 1664. Going back to an even earlier time, when the Dutch first came here in 1609, almost immediately after that, on Hudson's return to the Netherlands, there were a number of entrepreneurs who outfitted ships and sent them here to see what the situation was and to hopefully learn more, particularly about the fur trade. Those men were not simply people who came, ran in, traded some trinkets for furs from the Indians, but instead they took their time. And in fact, one of their ships burned, or was, it caught on fire and it was gone. And it gave the Dutch crew who was here ample time to explore further. As it turns out, these crews were staffed with people who were engineers, with some training in survey, for example, and apparently also in some degree of manners and etiquette with respect to meeting up with entirely new people altogether. Well, one of the maps that comes out at this time shows the Delaware River, the Hudson River, the Connecticut River, and this was a whole broad area that became New Netherland. And that map, which dates from about 1616, is the first time that the term New Netherland appears at all in the record. On this map, there's an account of 3 Dutchmen. It's just a note about it, very little is known, but 3 Dutchmen who were apparently captured at the head of, actually the Susquehanna River, and then taken into the Delaware Valley, and finally brought down to the mouth of the Delaware, where in fact they were ransomed by the Dutch, or their ransom was paid, and they got the 3 Dutchmen back. But with them came this great map along the whole route that they had traveled with the Indians. They were able to map the river, the mouth of the Delaware Bay, and also to include the names of Indian tribes who they found to the west, or even heard stories about to the west. Similarly, it was Adrian Block in this period who made another map. He sailed the entire coast of New England and produced quite a good map. He too put information about people that he met and other details on the map that were of interest and significance to the Dutch at that time. The first map I spoke of is interesting, particularly for us, because it contains the names of Kinderhook and Claverack written down for the first time. Fort Nassau, which was the first fort the Dutch built around Albany, also is included. And that remained a trading post up until the time Fort Orange, which was a much better construction and not in the floodplain, was made. And that really was the beginning of New Netherland. Actually, before Manhattan was identified or much explored, Hudson had met with difficulty with the Indians in the southern part of the river and had experienced good relations with the Mohican people here. That has to be at least part of the reason these first explorers came up and began to name places here and take time to give a little bit more detail on their map about this area. It may also be because it was actually closer to the source of the fur trade that they were able to do that as well. Those episodes are a long way ahead by about 2 generations or so from when Kinderhook came to be settled. There must certainly have been exploration and outposts here for trade with Indians for an extended period of time. And of course, it's interesting, the name, even though on this map it resided in an archive in the Netherlands until the mid-19th century, but the name was never forgotten by the people. So it wasn't until the 1660s that any land purchases were made, and that's the first time it really occurs in Dutch and more particularly in English records, is when these land purchases began to be made. 1669 is the year that this land and other land around Kinderhook village area was first acquired by Dutchmen. This is or was interestingly corroborated with some archaeological material that was found on this property that included 1660s white pipe stem, or it was a bowl, part of a bowl stamped with EB. It was a famous pipe maker of the era. And Kinderhook began to be settled fairly quickly. One petition for land in this area reads, "We can no longer make a living in this place. We are farmers and we want to go and buy land X." And it's a rather moving testament to the inclination of some of them. The fur trade was somewhat controlled, not by government authorities, but just by the community themselves. There was a hierarchy of fur traders, and they didn't want, if you will, the rabble to participate. So to just go and be a good farmer was a good future for many of the Dutch who came here. Kinderhook ended up becoming an important agricultural place. The flats, the low terraces along the creek are good farmland and what they wanted most. There are also sites of water power that they would use for timber mills first, and eventually for grist mills. The timber was harvested here and taken to the riverside and shipped to New York City and even places beyond. It was highly regarded. Shipping down the river, even though it might have been a chore to get goods or timber to the river, was almost like putting it on a superjet by comparison to having to haul overland. So the river was always an important thing up until the time of the train and cars. There were 31 proprietors at Kinderhook. 31 seemed to be a magic number to be used to be granted a charter for a town. And the town of Kinderhook was chartered in 1686-87. And sadly, the records from that, all of the early records from the town were lost in a fire in the late 19th century. There are glimpses, though, in court records, and once in a while a piece of correspondence turns up pertaining to the town, but you get a strong impression of a really intact community. A church was formally established here in 1719, and before that, people had gone to Albany for church, and then also sometimes their minister had come here to do maybe 4 weddings or 4 baptisms at one time, one day. You can see that clearly. After the first generation got through clearing land and getting their farms established, it began to become a very prosperous place. So the Van Alen house and some others like it that survived from the first third of the 18th century represent the achievements of not only the first generation, but also the second generation and what they were able to do. The staircase is not original to the house, but it was moved here at the time the house was restored in the late 1960s. It has kind of an interesting story behind it that pertains to the history of this building. The house had stood vacant from the mid-1930s up until the late 1960s, when the house was given to the Historical Society with the intent to restore it. The family of the builder had lived in this house until the late 1930s, and then I think a lateral cousin came and purchased the house with an intention of doing something with it, although at the time he wasn't sure. He owned it for 30 years or so, and then finally gave it to the Historical Society. He must have also come around and visited in the area early on. Again, going back to the 1930s, there was a house called the Breeze House, which is on the River Road in Rensselaer County, and he purchased the staircase out of that house. And maybe about 6 months later, that house burned, which was really very fortunate. It's distinctive, and it's like others in some others that survive in some other Dutch houses, but it's very bold, heavy turnings, and that's kind of a characteristic that is echoed in some of the Dutch furniture and other things. It looks almost Victorian in its design, but there it is. Here, the stair treads have got beaded moldings all the way up to a point. Then this staircase, as it's installed here, is a little bit different than what it probably was originally. It would have been shorter, and the top few stair treads would have been turned against the wall and gone on up that way. In any case, it's a great staircase. We'll go up it later on. The hallway that we're in is part of the addition to the house. And the main feature of this room is the one that's not here. There's no fireplace, which made it perhaps a nice cool place in the summer, but pretty worthless in the winter. But it still was useful because if you're using it coming in and out, rooms where there was fire, the doors could have been kept closed and heat retained in those rooms. It might also have been useful for functioning. There's a nice cross breeze through the back on hot days, so it works well. Here's something that's called a capstock, and this is a reproduction of one that has been found in a Dutch house in this area. They were attached to the wall and intended for hanging coats, whatever from. They're, again, this bold turning for the pegs. Now, a pegboard like this is a much simpler affair. Nonetheless, it's functional and it worked really very well. These are occasionally mentioned in estate inventories, but more often because they were literally attached to the wall, they became part of the house and are often not mentioned. The half door, this with a bolt that secures the top to the bottom when the doors are closed, was especially a characteristic of Dutch house. It was used up until the 19th century. I don't think you find them really built today except as sort of overly stylized pseudo-imitation Dutch doors. They have a great quality or character about them in that they let in a lot of light and fresh air. They're a great thing in the summertime especially. They kept animals out, children in or children out, and animals in, as the case may be. They just have a great appeal. And we'll see how that was used in the next room, a particular use for it. The house is made up of 3 main rooms in addition to the hallway. And this room is the kitchen, and probably always was. Here you can see something of, we saw the hearth support downstairs. Here's the hearth that it actually supports. And this is framed, the bricks are set in maybe like 6 inches of sand and can be adjusted somewhat. Some people believe that the bricks were pulled up and several handfuls of sand drawn out, thrown across the floor, and the Dutch housewife would scrub the floor and then sweep back the sand when it was dry. That's possible and even plausible. There are several things at the hearth that are of interest. One is the fire back. This is a reproduction, but large iron plates like this were always kept at the back of the chimney to, in effect, protect the brick wall from too much heat of the fire. This piece in particular is interesting because it is, although it's a little bit later period, it very much resembles a grill identified both in Dutch graphic art and also in estate inventories as a grill that was used for cooking fish. And the rods close together mean that it could be, the fish would not fall apart, it would keep it safe. Here's another grill that rotated. A small heat source of coals could be spread out a little bit on the floor or on the hearth, and that placed over it, and quite carefully controlled heat could be used for cooking in that way. Similarly, this footed pot could also have coals developed under it, and again used for cooking, or maybe with the higher feet, things could be kept warm there. There are a number of ingenious possibilities at this hearth, although it does keep one busy. Keeping a fire going in a hearth like this is difficult because of drafts, and it is my own experienced opinion that the Dutch door played an important role in regulating the draft on the floor and how the fire went. The alternative often was smoke billowing out all over the room, and days of high atmospheric pressure, low atmospheric pressure resulted in all kinds of different possibilities for the hearth and the fireplace. So you had to have sort of meteorological knowledge in order to get your cooking done for the day. The Dutch also had a particular care for children. The travelers, either in the Netherlands or here, often remarked about how much care and attention was lavished on children in Dutch households. And it began when they were quite young, obviously. There was